My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
And the need to use diplomacy and build international consensus to resolve our problems whenever possible.
Our diplomats are working with a range of partners to strengthen human rights protections.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
When we think of the Arctic, most of us conjure up long-held and fanciful visions of polar bears or of Santa Claus and his reindeer. Or, if you're like me and grew up in the 1980s, you might think back to a scene in the Cold War spy thriller Firefox, where Clint Eastwood lands his stolen, top-secret Soviet spy plane on the Arctic ice in order to refuel before a harrowing flight into American airspace. In reality, today's Arctic is melting, and vastly different from these romanticized images. The melting and opening up of the region is a marker of our rapidly changing climate everywhere on Earth. And in many ways, the geopolitics we see playing out today in the far north are a microcosm of global politics. What trends are we seeing in the Arctic today? What are the political and security implications of a changing region, not just for the far north, but around the world? I'm Kelly McFarland, Director of Programs and Research at the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy. For this episode, we posed critical questions on the Arctic to two experts. Jeremy Mathis is an environmental scientist. He has worked in the Arctic for more than 20 years and has held executive positions at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, including as the director of the Arctic Research Program from 2015 to 2018. From 2007 to 2012, he was a professor at the University of Alaska Fairbanks and the founding director of the first U.S. Ocean Acidification Research Center. Since 2018, Jeremy has been our colleague at Georgetown as an adjunct professor in the School of Foreign Service, where he teaches courses on environmental security. We'll hear from Jeremy on future episodes in this series too, in which we'll be exploring more aspects of environmental security, including food security and migration. We also spoke to Sherri Goodman. Sherri is an environmental security expert. She is a senior fellow at the Polar Institute of the Wilson Center and the Secretary General of the International Military Council on Climate and Security. Sherri is the former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security, during which time she led the Arctic Military Environmental Cooperation Program. Both Sherri and Jeremy participated in an ISD New Global Commons Working Group in 2017, which led to ISD's 2018 report, The New Arctic, Navigating the Realities, Possibilities, and Problems. We wanted to find out how trends in the Arctic had developed since then and where they might head going forward. Let's listen to the conversation. Welcome everyone to episode 3 of season 3 of Diplomatic Community, and I'd like to welcome and thank Sherri Goodman and Jeremy Mathis for joining us today.
Pleasure to be here, Kelly.
It's a pleasure, Kelly. Thanks for having me.
When we had the Arctic Working Group, it was to talk about the geopolitical implications of what was going on there, and you can't really do that without understanding the science behind what's going on and the climate change that's going on in the Arctic. And Jeremy, I vividly remember our first meeting back in the fall of 2017. You were there to provide a background briefing on what was going on in the Arctic and why it's opening up and why it's becoming a geopolitical, what's causing it to become a geopolitical issue. And can you talk to us a little bit about that and how things have shifted over the last few years in the Arctic? Where's climate change stand today in the Arctic?
Yeah, absolutely. And unfortunately, since 2017 and 2018, everything has just gotten worse. And so there's no good news to this story. The trends have deepened. What we thought 4 or 5 years ago may be anomalies, or what we thought may have been anomalies, have been demonstrated to be long-term trends that we're on now. So in the most simplest way, we see that the Arctic is warming at least twice as fast as the rest of the planet, and probably closer to 3 times as fast as the rest of the planet. So for every degree of temperature increase we hear about for the average planet, the Arctic is moving at least twice as fast as that. So it's not surprising that we're continuing to see record loss in sea ice cover. We're seeing record loss in snow cover. We're seeing temperature records be shattered every single year. And outside of those long-term climate trends that we can look at and understand, there's also some anecdotal things that are happening that get some attention, but I think illustrate just how extraordinary the changes are. In that this year, in 2021, it rained at Summit, Greenland for the first time in recorded history. So this is a high altitude observation location at northern Greenland, where we've had research and military installations, going back to before the Cold War. It's obviously supposed to be a very cold place. It's not supposed to rain there. And for this year, we saw a manageable or a measurable amount of rainfall happen at Summit, Greenland. So it's just extraordinary, and I don't think we put this in proper context as to just how fast things are changing and the implications that will have for the entire planet.
The quip we used in reverse was, what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. Can you talk a little bit about why does this matter for folks in the Gulf Coast or folks in Southeast Asia?
Sure. Well, the Washington Post did an analysis a couple of weeks ago that showed that in the past 3 months, 1/3 of all Americans have been impacted by an extreme weather event. So whether that was a hurricane, a wildfire, a drought, a heat wave. So these extreme weather events that we're seeing are part of a larger destabilizing of the climate that we rely on for everything in our life. And the Arctic is a big driver of that global climate. There's supposed to be a temperature gradient between the Arctic and the lower latitudes where we live down here in the lower 48. And that temperature gradient gives us the jet stream, which is a big air mass that circulates around the planet and controls most of the weather that we experience in our daily life. And as the Arctic warms 2 or 3 times as fast as the rest of the planet, that difference in temperature between the two air masses starts to break down, and it starts to become less predictable and less consistent with what we think we should experience as weather. And that's a contributing factor to some of these events that we've been experiencing lately. So there's the destabilizing weather effect because of the larger climate change at hand. And then there's also simply the amount of water that's being put into the ocean, whether it's ice melting off of Greenland or whether it's ice melting off of Antarctica. That's contributing to sea level rise. And for every inch of sea level rise that we have, that's another inch of water that's getting in somebody's home on the Gulf Coast during a hurricane or a storm surge. That's a more moist atmosphere that's contributing to these extraordinary rain events like we just saw with the remnants of Hurricane Ida that hit the Northeast with unprecedented rainfall. That's what we're going to experience more and more as we have a more destabilized climate and a wetter atmosphere that's capable of creating these huge rain events that we've been dealing with.
Yeah, I remember our working group was right after, and I'm blanking on the name of the hurricane now, but the one that dumped all the rain on Houston, and it was the same.
Yeah, Hurricane Harvey.
Yeah, Harvey
that flooded my entire family.
Yeah, and it was the same causation there. So as we look at the Arctic and think about the Arctic, though, Sherri, move a question to you on sort of the governance of the Arctic. And the Arctic is a lot of different, countries have territory in the Arctic, and then there's also the international waters in the middle of the Arctic. But how's the Arctic governed right now? Who's in charge, and sort of what does that look like?
Well, Kelly, the Arctic Council, which just recently celebrated 25 years in existence, is a body which brings together the 8 Arctic nations that are Arctic coastal nations. But in addition, other countries around the world, including China, and many European non-Arctic countries, as well as Japan, Singapore, South Korea, are observers to the Arctic Council. The Arctic Council has a mandate to address environmental conservation, communications issues in the Arctic. It does not address security. It's not a security organization. It's been successful in leading to legal agreements on some of the challenges we face in the Arctic, such as an increasing need for search and rescue. Search and rescue, as more ships navigate the Arctic, there are going to be more accidents. Also, potential oil spills. So the Arctic Council has led to legally binding agreements among the Arctic nations on oil spill prevention, on search and rescue collaboration, and most recently on science and technology collaboration. Those are all important sort of structures that help fit into the narrative of the Arctic has been a region of cooperation. At the same time, there is a competing narrative that coexists with the one of cooperation, which is of increased geostrategic competition, as Jeremy described the sea ice retreating, the temperatures warming, the permafrost collapsing across the Arctic. That has led to countries of the Arctic, particularly Russia, seeing the opportunities for economic reward in the region. And indeed, Putin has set very aggressive goals, President Putin, for transportation and shipping across the northern sea route. He envisions it as a toll road for transport from ports in Asia across to ports in Europe. And he's been building up his ice breaking capability, rebuilding military capability and bases, nuclear powered vessels, floating nuclear power plants, and many, many more, and conducting extensive exercises, some that even buzzed Alaskan fishermen and forced them to flee legal fishing grounds last summer. So we've seen an increasingly aggressive Russian set of Russian military activities in and around the Arctic. At the same time, China has declared itself to be a near Arctic stakeholder and released its first ever Arctic policy in 2018, where it called for a polar Silk Road that would extend its Belt and Road Initiative across the Arctic beyond the Asian and African routes it is already using to extend its reach and global quest for resources. So that has dramatically changed the opportunities that China has been engaging with countries around the world to develop its capabilities to operate in the Arctic. And there is this coexistence now between the narratives of cooperation and competition.
On the environmental side, and Jeremy, I'll ask you, and both of you can comment on this if you want, but I think it's important to remember as we see other countries go in there and China become more active and stuff, that there is also a large amount of people that live there, the indigenous folks that are up in the region and living in the Arctic. How is this affecting them, the climate change and the environmental change, and what sort of challenges are they seeing with this, with the warming weather? And Sherri, you mentioned collapsing permafrost. What are we seeing on the ground up there today?
Well, just to put it very simply, Kelly, it's extraordinary change. The people that are living in the Arctic probably have the most environmental instability of anybody on the planet right now. That the place that they live is changing so fast that they just have no hope of really being able to adapt to it in any meaningful way. And we're seeing coastal villages be destroyed by either sea level rise or inundation from storms because of the sea ice melting. We're seeing other villages further inland not be able to practice their traditional subsistence hunting because wildlife migration patterns are changing. It's getting harder for them to go out into the environment because of things like wildfires. So these folks are struggling to adapt to any kind of normal life, and we're failing them on honestly, that we are not doing enough to highlight the challenges that they face and think about bringing resources to bear that would not only help them now but help us understand how these impacts are going to cascade out of the Arctic to everybody around the planet. The Arctic right now is a looking glass for our future, and we're not really taking advantage of that. We're ignoring it, and to back to a point that Sherri made with Russia, and it's something that hasn't been reported, is that Russia held in August an unprecedented event to simulate a crisis situation, and that's what they define it as a crisis situation. And their emergency minister, Zenichev, was killed during that exercise. He was a close friend of Vladimir Putin, former KGB, and a senior Russian minister that was up in the Arctic participating in this emergency response exercise. It would be the equivalent if our FEMA administrator, the Secretary of Homeland Security, had been killed in the U.S. Arctic during an exercise. And we're just not talking about those sorts of events and the investments and the focus that Russia and even China are putting in this region, that the U.S. just isn't matching that in any meaningful way.
I want to pick up first on where Jeremy left off to talk about what keeps me up at night about Arctic change, because this unexpected and tragic fatality of a Russian emergency response minister during an exercise, to me, is emblematic of the increasing risk of accidents. Here you have an accident that occurred unintended during an event where the Russians were supposed to be preparing and increasing their capability to respond to search and rescue and accidents in the Arctic, and they had an accident during the exercise, right? A tragic accident. And with sea ice retreat, rising temperatures, sea level rise, permafrost collapse, those risks of accidents and the increasing number of people operating in the Arctic all rise. So we already have heightened risk of accidents, and we're not prepared for those. I worry deeply, just as we are so unprepared for the devastating climate-fueled hurricanes, wildfires, and floods that we now face across the lower 48. We are even more unprepared for an accident that could be even more severe in the Arctic and might not involve just one country. Could involve, ships colliding, having an accident in the Bering Strait between Russia and the U.S., where they're at their closest point. The countries are only 30 miles apart. Could involve a Chinese vessel. We did a scenario exercise a few years ago, looking at a Russian nuclear-powered icebreaker colliding with its Chinese liquid fuel natural gas (LNG) transport in the Bering Strait, and how would we be able to respond, and what kind of oil spill search and rescue capability would we need? So that brings us to how well is the U.S. prepared? The U.S. is now trying to rebuild its icebreaking capability, which we now have the equivalent of 1.5 icebreakers on their last legs, which really need to be replaced. They are multi-decades old at this point. We have a program to replace them, but the new vessels, now called polar security cutters, won't be deployed for another at least a couple of years or beyond that. At the meantime, the U.S. is trying to rebuild its capability to operate in the surface and on land in the Arctic, but also faces similar challenges such as permafrost collapse at military bases in Alaska. And we know that is also happening across parts of Russia, and that may have even exacerbated recent industrial accidents that occurred in places like Norilsk with substantial diesel spills and other additional contamination occurring. We don't well understand the extent of the ecological damage that occurred in that region that could also affect Arctic waters, which the circulation of which could move into international waters. So, in the last administration, there was a focus on the geostrategic aspects of the competition of the region, and an effort to, as former Secretary of Defense Mathis said, up our game in the Arctic, which we need to do. But as I often say, we need to be able to walk and chew gum. We need to up our game to operate both for risk of accidents and potential geostrategic competition in the Arctic. But we also need to pay attention to the dramatic climate change that's occurring there and the environmental risks. We have black carbon in the Arctic, which is a more potent greenhouse gas than most others. So we have an opportunity potentially, if we can collaborate, to begin to reduce that very potent greenhouse gas. We should be doing that. But we should be managing for other resources across the region. And let's not forget, there are people that live in the region. The indigenous population have their way of life is changing dramatically as they can no longer subsistence hunt and fish in the same ways. And also their knowledge of the region is extremely important. They are really the domain awareness and at the front lines of understanding how the region is changing. And so now we talk about co-production of knowledge with the indigenous population, and that's becoming increasingly important. And that's also important in our academic circles, that we understand how to integrate that co-production of indigenous and Western knowledge both into our research and our practices, because they are on the front lines of change, observing and witnessing that change that goes into our being able to build out a more robust Arctic research infrastructure, which the U.S. is now considering, and I think is very, very important. We need to be able to have better eyes and ears in all domains across the region, both to understand the rapidity of change and to prepare and be able to respond to it.
And I'll follow up with one more thing there, Kelly, if I could, just to pull on one of those threads. Another very frightening development that we're seeing, and where I think the co-production of knowledge could be very beneficial, is across Siberia, there are methane craters that are starting to emerge. And these are places where it looks like a bomb has gone off. There's a huge hole in the ground, but it wasn't a bomb. It was an explosion of gas out of the ground itself. And so as the permafrost warms, as the soil thaws out, all the old material that's in that soil gets broken down by bacteria. It creates methane, and then that methane explodes out into the atmosphere. And so if you fly over in a helicopter, it does look like an impact crater or a meteor, but it's not something that has hit the Earth. It's something that is coming out of the Earth. And so it's millions and millions of tons of methane gas. And methane is 80 times more efficient than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. So when we think about mitigating our carbon emissions and rolling back our emissions from fossil fuels, that's a great step, and we should absolutely be thinking about that. But at the same time, the environment is already responding to the warming temperatures that we've already incurred with things like these methane craters that are pumping even more gas into the atmosphere that will make the planet that much warmer. So again, I keep going back to this Arctic as a bellwether and the Arctic as a lens for us to see what our future looks like. And right now, it's very challenging for the trends that are observable in the Arctic.
This kind of gets to my next question too, on sort of, Sherri, where do you see the geopolitical competition of this going in the next, I don't know, half decade or so, with rising interest from these other countries, with Russia building things up, with us trying to catch up in many ways? How do we do that without creating a security dilemma in the region? While also, one thing we talked a lot about in the working group was the need to continue pushing science diplomacy and the interaction between countries that might be rivals in many ways, but the need to have that collaboration on a scientific side. And Jeremy, you mentioned it, how important it is for us to have the operational knowledge of, or the knowledge of what's going on in Siberia, and collaborating with other scientists and stuff. So how do we sort of thread that needle moving forward? And where do you see that going, Sherri?
Just as, during the Cold War, we used nuclear arms negotiations to help reduce risk of an accident when our nuclear missiles were on alert status, and to avoid bolt out of the blue nuclear attack. We need to build confidence today among Arctic nations to reduce the risks of accidents, even while we're in an era where the U.S., Russia, and others are increasing their military and other capabilities in the region. I do think we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We need to understand the points of tension, the increased risks of accidents and share sufficient information to reduce those risks.
Yeah, if I can just add one thing to that. I think we have to keep in mind a basic premise that climate change in a lot of ways is good for Russia. And I think Putin sees the opportunities that climate change will bring, the opening up the Arctic, opening up parts of Russia to greater agricultural activities. And I agree with Sherri completely that we can walk and chew gum at the same time, and we have to look for those opportunities where we can collaborate, particularly in the scientific space. But I also think we can never forget who we're dealing with as an adversary on the Russian side, and make sure that our entire national strategy is aligned such that we have presence and understanding and the right approach to every facet of what's happening in the Arctic, not just any one piece of it.
So every time we talk about icebreakers, I mean, I know that Russia's got like 40 and China's got more than we do at this point, and everything, and it always wraps back around spending more money. The U.S. needs to spend more money to get icebreakers, but at the same time, the ice is melting and it's going away, and these things take a really long time to build and get funding for. With the focus on trying to build more and more icebreakers to catch up, so to speak, in some manner, is this like building battleships in 1945? Should we be spending money on something else? Should we be thinking more long term on like what we're going to need in the Arctic?
I think the answer, Kelly, is yes. Both things can be true. I think we need to be strategic in where we're making our investments for our operational capabilities in the Arctic and what those capabilities need to be. We are seeing extraordinary loss of ice in the Arctic during the summer, but in the wintertime, it's cold and dark and there's lots of ice up there. So we need to be able to have surface capabilities up there in the winter, just like the Russians do. So that will require icebreakers and will always require icebreakers. In the summer months when it's ice free, I think we can think about what other assets can we put into the Arctic that don't have to be an icebreaker or even ice strengthened as we go into the next decade and beyond. So that's where I think the strategic planning process needs to be more well defined, of not just let's go build a bunch of icebreakers, but thinking about what we actually need from a surface presence capability when it comes to the Arctic, and make those investments appropriately.
So if I could add to that, Kelly, and we need to be able to have capabilities to operate in all domains. The U.S. has long had capabilities to operate in the undersea and space domains, and we continue to have the strategic capabilities we need in that regard, as well as ballistic missile defense. What we need now in the climate era is we need the ability to operate at the surface as well, for both military and civilian, for strategic and tactical operational capabilities. And so that's why think of the polar security cutters or the icebreakers as just one piece of the overall capability we need. We also have to re-equip our land forces to operate, as increasingly we have let that capability lapse during the Cold War.
I'll get you guys out of here on this last question, because I know in our working group 4 years ago, there was a lot of discussion on the Arctic Council, and that's, Sherri, why I asked you to sort of give us a little overview of that. And folks at the working group were sort of torn on how to move forward in the 21st century on Arctic issues and the role of the Arctic Council. And there were some that said Arctic Council's worked great for 25 years now. We need to keep it the same. There's others that said it worked great for an Arctic of 25 years ago, but it's changing, and the Arctic Council needs serious reform and restructuring to fit with that. Where do you guys see that moving forward? What role does the Arctic Council play?
The Arctic Council is one important piece of the overall confidence building framework we need in the Arctic today. The Arctic Council continues to be a useful forum for environmental exchange and action, for communication, for culture, for telecommunications, for sustainability. And we should keep that going, both for the substance of the work, but also for the opportunities for cooperation and trust building where possible. At the same time, we should be looking for other forums for confidence building and to reduce risk in the Arctic. Some of those could be a version of an agreement for addressing unplanned incidents at sea that has been very useful in the Pacific region among navies. And there are a whole set of confidence building opportunities that could be had among naval and other military forces to reduce risk and to provide sufficient information about the operating activities of military forces so that they don't come into conflict in the future.
All right, Sherri Goodman, Jeremy Mathis, I appreciate the time, and it was good seeing both of you again. You know, the Arctic, as I've mentioned before, is a fascinating region, and it really is a microcosm of the broader world right now with the effects of climate change, geopolitical tensions. So I appreciate you guys taking the time to come and chat with us today, and thanks again.
Thank you for having us, Kelly.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Alan.
That was Diplomatic Immunity. Thanks for listening. Please rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever they listen to podcasts. Follow us on Twitter @GeoDiplomacy, and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. See you next time.